going to record this as well and going live on Facebook.
Live. Yes.
So we're delighted to have Lunchtime Learning once again. We've got 18 devices on so far. I imagine we'll have some more. And Rabbi Seymour Rossel and I first met in Israel when he was chairing the Conference of Alternatives in Jewish Education. He has made a career of publishing and writing and storytelling. He's got 4 children, 2 of whom are rabbis, and the other 2 fine professionals in their own right. And for a while, he was our neighbor. He's living in Dallas, but he was even closer. For 5 years, he was the rabbi of Congregation Jewish Community North in Spring. And so he's got a wonderful story today to tell us that includes lots of different things about Holocaust victims, survivors, and Warsaw, and told as only Rabbi Seymour Rossel.
Oh, Gesundheit, whatever. We're going to talk about the Warsaw Ghetto, and of course, it sounds like a downer, but it's anything but in this particular instance. The details of what happened there are not pleasant, but what we're going to talk about is an essential part. So it begins with looking at the idea of the Geniza, which is a hiding place. It's a hiding place in the sense that it's a place we go to put away old manuscripts that are no longer useful, things that have the name of God in them, for example, which we don't want to destroy. So when they're damaged or worn, they can be collected and placed into a Geniza. And there are some Jerusalem synagogues that gathered collections to burn every 7th year, for example, while they were praying for rain, and burning those were considered to be good luck for rain. But the Genizas can take a lot of different forms. This is a Geniza on the far left from a cemetery in Kolkata, India. And then we have a possible Geniza, we think it was, at Masada. We found, this is a modern Geniza collection. It looks to us like a trash bin, but this is right in Jerusalem. And then we're going to talk a minute about the Geniza that was discovered in 2012. So let's just quickly go through this. The most famous Geniza in the world was the Geniza at the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. The present synagogue was remodeled in the 19th century, and then it was remodeled again in the 20th century. And the Cairo Geniza was behind the Ark. It was shaped like a 2-story high silo, with its only entrance was near the roof. You can see it all the way at the top up there where the light is like a window. The first European that purchased some of these documents was Rabbi Jacob Safir, and that was around 1874 or so. So from 1889 to 92, those contents, while the synagogue was being remodeled, were laying in an enormous pile out in the open. And the synagogue today is only a museum, of course, because the Cairo community has been sort of forced to move in so many different ways. In the 1890s, though, pieces of antique documents began to show up on the marketplace. And Solomon Schechter was led by a couple of people to examine a possibility that they came from Egypt. So he soon traced their origin back to the Ben Ezra Synagogue. He located the Geniza behind the Ark, and then he managed to make a deal to acquire about 70% of the material, which came to about 140,000 documents for Cambridge University. So this was a like major find. What kinds of stuff was found is amazing too. It had materials starting way back when in the 9th century and going up to about the 13th century. So for example, here's a letter that was signed by Moses Maimonides. And there's a fragment of a note from the poet and philosopher Yehuda Halevi. So you can see that the stuff that they began to find was just amazing and important. In 2012, another Geniza was discovered. Believe it or not, these things just happen. And this one was in the attic of a synagogue in Alsace. So thousands of documents and objects dating from about the 14th to the 19th century were all up there in the attic laying on the floor. You see how they are on that photo on the right. The purpose of the Geniza, of course, is not to save documents for future historical study. The purpose is not that at all, but every historian prays for this cache of documents to be found because it gives us such a tremendous glimpse into the past. And here they are collecting documents that can be saved. And that takes us to the point of talking about a historian, because this was the Geniza of Cairo was the major historical find of the early 20s. Okay, so by 1920, most of this stuff was being read and being studied. It had taken that long for the scholars at Cambridge to begin to work their way through this stuff. And by the way, it's not completely worked through yet. So there's still material there that they haven't yet deciphered. But along comes a young man whose name is Emanuel Ringelblum, who's a historian. He's the most responsible for documenting the Warsaw Ghetto, and that's why we're talking about him today. His story is bound up with Warsaw, with the ghetto, and in some rather unique ways I think you're going to find. He was born in 1900 in Bucha in Ukraine. He had a brother and two sisters. He had a mother who died in 1912 when he was only 12. His father was a grain merchant, identified himself not with any synagogue, but with the Jewish Enlightenment. And he sent Emmanuel to the Cheder, but also to the public school. So the family moved then from Bucha to Nowy Sącz, I think that's how it's pronounced, in Poland at the start of World War I to avoid the Cossack pogroms that were aimed at the Jews in the Ukraine. Emmanuel joined the Poalei Zion, which was a Zionist youth movement. And in 1922, he was also accepted to the Warsaw University to study history. So he left this beautiful little town to go to Warsaw. In Warsaw, he made his living by giving private lessons and translating, just like Dan Gordon. He does this stuff. And he married a beautiful woman whose name was Judith or Judita Herman, and she was a fellow marcher on the Poalei Zion marches. So he received his Warsaw. He received his PhD in 27. And by 29, he was hired to do social work with the interest-free funding central, like a, what do we call it in Houston? There's a name for that bank, which makes free loans. The Hebrew Free Loan, right? Hebrew Free Loan Society. Anyway, in 1930, his only child, Uri, was born. And he began to edit a magazine called the Volkshilf, until about 38. He joined the Union of Jewish School Teachers, and he was active in the history group of the, I'm going fast, but I hope it's not too fast for you. He continued his historical research and writing, and in 40, he was credited by 1940 already, he had over 125 publications. This was a busy guy. This was a busy guy. In the late 30s, he worked full-time for the Joint. That's the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, still going strong today. It helps with immigration, it helps with settlement, it helps also with communities. So in 1938, he was deep into joint initiatives, including trying to help 6,000 Polish Jews who had been expelled from Germany and were stuck in a Polish border camp. So here's a good example of marching in Warsaw. Warsaw was a place where Jews were large numbers and also very well represented, and so were the labor movements. In 38, he gave up all of his teaching positions. He wanted to concentrate full-time on social work in the Jewish community. He saw that most Poles did not value Jewish citizens, so he wanted to enhance everybody's awareness of what Jews had done in the past. And as a historian, he was also aware of that massive treasure which we looked at in the Warsaw Ghetto. In August 39, he went to the 21st Zionist Congress in Geneva. And at the start of the war, he was urged, because it was just beginning, he was urged to stay in the West. But he made the decision to return to Warsaw for the sake of his social work. I just want you to take one good look at that photograph. If you've ever seen worried leaders, that's what worried leaders really look like, okay? Look at Ben-Gurion's head down in his arms. Look at right next to him, Chaim Weizmann, with his head on his forehead. And right next to him, I think that is Ber Borochov on the left, and who's that on the right? In any case, these were all major leaders, even in the second row you see. And there is Emanuel Ringelblum, still very young, among those people. But he decided to go back to Warsaw, and he began writing a personal journal that he continued up to the end of 1944. In November 40, his house, the house he was living in at 18 Lesno Street, was enclosed. It was enfolded into the Warsaw Ghetto, and now he and his wife and his son were shut inside the ghetto. So these are early photographs from the Warsaw Ghetto. This is a bridge, because the Warsaw Ghetto had actually a bigger part and a smaller part, and Jews needed to be able to cross over to get from one part to the other. You can see that this one bridge got a lot of use. We'll talk about it in a moment. So the ghetto was established in October of 40. It was Nazis rounding up Jews in the suburbs in the city of Warsaw, and the ghetto population was around 400,000, 30% of the population of Warsaw, and the wall was built in November by Jewish workers under Nazi supervision. The wall moved from time to time, but it generally surrounded an area of about 1.3 square miles. Imagine that, 1.3 square miles with 400,000 people. Let's take a look what that means. Here's Warsaw, and that small area which is in dark is the Warsaw Ghetto. Here's the shape of the ghetto, all right? These are two different views of it. You can see that there's a smaller part at the bottom. Can you see my pointer? There's a smaller part at the bottom and a larger part at the top. And getting from one to the other over here was that bridge we saw before. And as you can see, even though the ghetto looks like it's a little bigger, the fact is that the two cemeteries were included in the ghetto, and they were the least populous of all the ghettos. So inside the walls in 40, there were 400,000, okay? 2.4% of Warsaw's area. The density was about 200,000 people per square mile. Housing was 9.2 people per available room. Here's an artist's depiction of the density of the Warsaw Ghetto. So this is where the people are over here. Here's the cemetery. Obviously, there was a lot of disease. Obviously, there was a lot of unemployment. There was poverty. The streets were filled with orphans and with people who had no place to go, overcrowded rooms, and led to all kinds of things. One of the most important pieces of surviving in the ghetto was smuggling. And they had the best people to do the smuggling were young children who could fit through the sewers of the town quickly and easily, and hundreds of them became professional smugglers. We have here a picture of a couple of the police officers in the Warsaw Ghetto rounding up a 5-year-old. But smuggling was becoming a way of life. And here's 3 guys on the right who are very proud to show their faces. And on the left, you can see they're hiding their faces so that you can tell the difference between who's taking the photograph. On the left, the photograph is being taken not by Jews, but by Nazis. And on the right, the photograph is obviously being taken by Jews. You with me? At the same time that that's going on, there's this fantastic cultural life inside the ghetto. Art and theater and music and literature, they continue to flourish, and schools are organized for children and adults. The most popular subject in the Warsaw Ghetto for adults was English, which tells you what they wanted for their future. There were a lot of self-help organizations established inside the ghetto, and even orphanages were maintained to the very, very, very end. If you were in an orphanage, it looked like that on the right, and it was not the most pleasant place, but you were fed and clothed and tended for as well as the community could. And in fact, we have the budget of the Warsaw Ghetto community, which we'll tell you about why we have that. And we know exactly what they were spending on orphanages. And it was a large proportion. On the left, you see, if you weren't in the orphanage, you were out on the street selling used candles or anything that you could get your hands on. Which brings us to a story which is a story within a story. This is the story of Janusz Korczak. Those of you who do know who Janusz Korczak was, forgive me because I'm about to tell you again. The Treblinka death camp was probably the final destination for a lot of Jews who were transported out of Warsaw. And today there's a memorial there for 16,000 broken tombstones. All but one bear the names of cities, shtetls, villages of Jews murdered in the gas chambers. Only one has the name of an individual, and it's the name of Janusz Korczak in large letters, with the name Henryk Goldschmidt under it and the date of his death in August 42. He was born as Henryk Goldschmidt in 1878. It was a wealthy family. He had great schooling, almost no Jewish education. He wanted to be a writer until 1889 when his father had a nervous breakdown and could never again work. So Henryk went to medical school and became a pediatrician. Meanwhile, he also entered a play in competition, but since the play was about mental illness and his father had had a nervous breakdown, he used the nom de plume taken from the hero of a popular Jewish novel, a popular Polish novel, excuse me, and that hero's name was Janusz Korczak, and that became a part of his writing career. Henryk he lived 2 lives, as a pediatrician and as Korczak, a best-selling author. In 1901, he wrote a famous book in Poland called The Children of the Street, which was a shocking study of street urchins in the Warsaw, the whole city of Warsaw. And in 1906, he followed up by writing about children of privilege, a book called Children of the Salon, and this time documenting the lives of spoiled wealthy children and showing that it wasn't much better than the lives of those who were orphans out on the street. So he began drafting something called the Bill of Rights for Children. He was challenged then by the government to open an orphanage to follow his own teachings. And most orphanages then were very kind and boring waiting stations. And Korczak did build a totally new model. He built an orphanage with a school government of its own, student courts, student judges, a school newspaper with the articles on such a high level that it was reprinted daily in every major, in a major Warsaw newspaper. And he had challenging classes for the students, and he had students building successful careers instead of waiting just to be adopted. In 20, he opened a second orphanage, this time for Catholic children at the behest of the church. And he called his two orphanages Children's Republics. And in 28, as Korshak, he wrote a beautiful book called King Matt I, his first best-selling children's book. He became as famous in Poland as Giselle did, as Dr. Seuss. His children's books sold in 20 languages, sometimes better than Peter Pan or Alice in Wonderland. And in the 30s, Korshak took to the radio as the old doctor, answering questions to help parents make their children's lives better. This was his way of being. He went to visit some of his graduates from the orphanage who had moved to Palestine in the 30s, and they lived on a kibbutz. He loved the kibbutz. He loved the way kibbutz was organized. It was perfect. It was like his children's republics. And in fact, he promised to come back and return, even though he never was able to. But he promised to return and bring with him many orphans. But when he returned to Poland, unfortunately, it was exactly when Poland was invaded, and both of his children's republics were closed, and 200 orphans, the Jewish ones, were confined with him in the Warsaw Ghetto, where he opened a new orphanage there. The end for him came on August 6th. He forced the German police to wait while they got the children ready and dressed. They marched in a very neat row, the 200 of them, 5 across, and Korshak took, you can see the march right above here in this photograph. Korshak took the 2 smallest children by the hands, and sometimes even carried the smallest. A lot of Poles had reached out in the meanwhile to rescue Korshak. Many of them thought of him as a beloved author, a beloved doctor. But he told them, you do not leave a sick child in the night, and you do not leave children at a time like this. That's the beginning of the end. So what do we know? We know a lot about what went on in the Warsaw Ghetto, and how do we know it? Where did we get all these fantastic photographs? Just have to stop for a moment of commercial. Okay, now we've seen that. This is part 2 for you. The group called itself ONEG SHABBAT. Emanuel Ringelblum was the man who was collecting notes and writing daily, weekly, and monthly summaries of what was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto. And in 1940, as the ghetto walls went up, he organized a group of intellectuals, scholars, and artists to form a documenting group, a group that would keep track of what happened. Ringelblum assembled them, and the group was fully formed by the last months of 1940 as the walls of the ghetto closed. They met on Saturdays, so they called themselves, rather ironically, because we know that it's supposed to be an enjoyment thing, the ONEG Shabbat, the Sabbath celebration. And they began to bring together things that were not known outside the ghetto. For example, one of the group was a man named Shmuel Winter. He was a founder of YIVO in Vilna. He financially supported the ONEG Shabbat and helped the Jewish Fighting Organization purchase arms. He worked for the cultural organization in Warsaw, and in 1943 he was murdered. Hertz Wasser was Ringelblum's closest collaborator. He was the secretary of the ONEG Shabbat. He was recruited by Ringelblum in 40. He handled the organization, collected documents, and controlled the finances. He was the only survivor who knew the exact place where the archives were hidden. We'll see. Versatility was the main principle. Objectivism was a second principle, and labor was divided. So some people were responsible for documentation and evidence, some collected and edited personal accounts, some followed the daily lives of people, some creatives contributed things like essays and memoirs, literary works, art, and photographs, because photography was very popular. When news of the mass murder of the Jews reached Warsaw in early '42, ONEG SHABBAT began to change their focus. They began to document instead the extermination of Jewish communities in order to make this knowledge public. So they stayed in contact with the Polish resistance movements, and they passed copies of collected evidence to them. And in 1942, thanks to the Polish and Jewish organizations, ONEG SHABBAT's reports on the destruction of the communities and existence of death camps reached the West. In summer of 1942, the Gross Aktion, the Great Roundup, went on for months, trapping Jews at random inside the ghetto and loading them on trains of 50 to 60 cars bound for the death camp at Treblinka. It became clear to all that few, if any, Warsaw Ghetto Jews were going to survive the war. Ringelblum knew. Less than 1 month before the deportations from Warsaw to Treblinka, he wrote, "The extermination is being executed according to a plan and schedule prepared in advance. Only a miracle can save us, the sudden end of the war. Otherwise, we're lost." This is, of course, one of the most famous photographs of the roundup. This little child in the front of the line and the soldiers behind. Now there was this legend that began to grow up about letters from deportees, people who had been taken away by the train. It was always a third person who heard from someone else that so-and-so had read the letter, and they always requested money and belongings. Those letters were almost always delivered by Polish Christians. By the way, these are from Ringelblum's notes, who managed to reach the proper address after overcoming various difficulties. These amicable Poles were willing to take money and clothing back for the deportees. They were also prepared to aid in the search for others who had been deported, naturally in return for the payment of hundreds of thousands of zlotys. You can imagine these are Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. They have not got much on their own, but they want to protect those who have been transported east to do work, and obviously these people could help them, and there were people who paid out tens of thousands of zlotys to find their closest relatives. But even though, Ringelblum writes, such news from relatives was exposed as a swindle time and time again, others could always be found who were willing to pay a high price for the slightest news of their loved ones. These swindlers play on the unpopular imagination, which constantly dreams and won't ever stop dreaming, that hundreds of thousands and millions of deportees are alive, are working, and will even return. I don't have to tell you how this works, because you get these emails all the time about, oh yeah, somebody's relative in Bangladesh suddenly died and left behind millions of dollars, and all you have to do is put up a few thousand and all those millions can be yours, right? So people will take advantage of the worst kinds of disaster. They'll take advantage of the worst kinds of depression. They'll take advantage of the poorest people even, in order to make money for themselves. We come to a very important moment. Jewish groups had been arguing since the ghetto walls went up about when to rise up against the Nazis. But the problem was that there were very, very few arms inside the ghetto. There were very, very few. Jews who knew how to use weapons. And so there had to be a period of long planning and smuggling of arms and strategizing. More still, there were many different Zionist movements and many different youth movements, and some socialists and some Zionists, and they didn't get along that well. They were very much in opposition to one another. So until the Great Roundup, there was a lot of infighting. But after the Great Roundup, deported 265,000 Jews in only 3 months, and 35,000 were murdered inside the ghetto during the same months. The ghetto had gone down from about 400,000 people to a total of 60,000 remaining. This was a very large change. Now the ghetto occupied an even smaller piece of Polish real estate, and the deportations had taken people off, never to be seen again, of course. And inside this smaller ghetto, the organization became tighter and tighter. In 43, in April, first night, I believe it was, of Passover, if I'm not mistaken, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began when German troops and police entered the ghetto to deport its surviving inhabitants. But the ghetto fighters had already organized themselves, and 750 fighters fought the heavily armed and well-trained Germans. They were then joined by many others who did what they could. These 750 fighters had organized themselves to create a blocking of the ghetto entrance so that the Germans couldn't get inside. But you can see that this was a very limited uprising. It took place wherever you see the red dots. Okay, so it was happening in 2 different areas, and it was happening along the main road, coming down the center of the ghetto over here, the entrance from the right, going down back this way, and there was also the train station down over here. Ghetto fighters fought on for nearly a month, and they continued until May of 16th. It's amazing. 750 fighters, who may have become 1,000 or 1,200, were able to hold off a division of Nazi soldiers, well armed and well equipped, with major machine guns and tanks and everything. More than 56,000 Jews were captured and about 7,000 were shot. The remainder were all deported to death camps. Many of them were hiding out inside buildings. Some of them were hiding out in bunkers underneath buildings. You can see here a bunker being emptied by the Nazis. They went house to house, they searched it, and they were very embarrassed by the fact that they had not been able to put this rebellion down in such a quicker fashion. The heroes of the rebellion were amazing, and they fought to the very end, so that the very last of them, we have the account of how that very last building fell, and it's amazing. They were fighting still from floor to floor as they moved upward. Now, Ringo Bloom, remember him, our historian. Ringo Bloom had been arranging for the archives to be packed in some big, heavy containers. And April 18th, one day before the uprising began, he split the ONEG SHABBAT archive into 3 sections, 3 groups of metal containers, and buried them beneath buildings. Almost all of the ONEG SHABBAT members perished in this uprising in 1943. Ringelblum's wife had been taken in the winter roundups in 1942, and now he took his son and he crossed into Polish Warsaw, and he and his son hid in a narrow, crowded little bunker, along with a number of others. The bunker, 38 people, was betrayed in 1944. A man and his wife had an argument, and he ran out, and he was angry, and he went to the authorities and said, "There's a bunker here with 38 people in it. Go and get them." And Ringelblum and his son were executed in Warsaw in March of 1944. This was what the bunker he was living in looked like. It was just a stack of places for people to sleep in turns. They couldn't all sleep at once. And it was a very crowded little space. The uprising was over, so the Germans dynamited the ghetto. This is what it looked like in 1945. I want you to get a good look at that. And the reason why I say that is because if you came back home one day and your city looked like that, finding home would be quite difficult, especially in a city, especially inside of a city. This is inside of Warsaw. There were only 3 members of the ONEG SHABBAT who survived, and that was lucky. That was totally by luck. In fact, Hertz and Bluma, 2 of them, husband and wife, had been on a train bound for Treblinka and had managed, when the train stopped once, to climb out a window and disappear into the forest, so that their escape was totally amazing. Rachel Auerbach, who also escaped, was managed to blend into the Christian. She looked Christian enough to blend in to the Christian side of Warsaw, which many people did in order to survive. And these were the only 3 who survived from the ONEG SHABBAT. The ONEG SHABBAT had done things like this. They had given diaries, blank diaries, to people and said, "Why don't you keep a diary for us for a while?" They had sat down with people and interviewed them in their homes. They had gone to the hospitals and talked with the nurses. They had gone to the orphanages and spoken with the orphanages. They had done what they could in order to bring together. There were even statisticians who brought together statistics. They collected documents from the Jewish government, and they collected documents, Nazi documents, orders to the Gestapo, which they managed to get. In '46, Hertz led a team to recover one hidden archive at the former location of Novolipki 68. But finding Novolipki 68 took them almost 3 months, literally, finding that one address, because there were no GPSs, right? So they had to do it by tracing streets, and sometimes that was not so easy. Even if you knew where the original gate was coming in, once you were inside rubble. It was all rubble. So they worked their way around and around, finally found the first cache, and another cache was found in the same way in 1950. Here they are in the first cache, bringing up, that's Hearst in the bottom, he's bringing up the archive from down below where it was hidden. And each box, when it was opened, was filled with documents. They hadn't been hidden for so long, but the inspiration of the Kairogeniza on the historian had been a good one, because this is how the documents managed to survive. They found this note too. The men who buried these archives know that they may not survive to see the moment when the treasure is dug up and the whole truth proclaimed. What we were unable to scream out to the world, we've concealed underground. One thing I'm proud of, namely that in these disastrous and horrible days, I had been chosen to help bury the treasure in order that you may know of the tortures and murders of the Nazi tyrants. Blessed be those whom fate saved from suffering. This is what it was. 35,370 pages, accounts, 764 journals, 380 files, 120 scholarly essays, 88 literary works, 76 photographs, and 54 underground press titles. The pages were written in Polish, in Yiddish, in Hebrew, in German. They also included the photographs and paintings and drawings and diaries of Ringelblum and others. By the way, Emanuel's Ringelblum's diary is published and available in English. It's called The Warsaw Diary of Emanuel Ringelblum. It's a wonderful book. German documents were included when they concerned the deportation and murder of Jews, not only from Warsaw, but also they had collected from other towns and cities. And Ringelblum had been in contact all that time with Jews who had escaped the Chelmno death camp and witnessed those deportations firsthand. These are the kinds of things they found. Food vouchers, tram tickets, photographs, illustrations. Inside the ghetto, they were manufacturing candy still, making candy wrappers, brochures, posters, ID cards. The archivists began the task of preserving and documenting what was found. The second cache was found inside of milk cans, big, enormous milk cans, such as were delivered to institutions and hospitals. The first cache had been found inside of metal boxes. So let me just tell you about a few of these people. Here's Jaleh. She graduated from the Warsaw Academy of Fine Arts, and her work was shown in several pre-war exhibitions. And in the ghetto, she worked with the ONEG SHABBAT and also taught drawing. Some of her artwork was buried in the archive, and she was killed with her husband, Israel Lichtenstein, and her daughter, Margalit, fighting in the ghetto revolt. This was written on the back. I donate my work to the Jewish Museum to be founded in the future. In order to restore the pre-war Jewish culture up to 1939. I think this is a self-portrait. What do you think? Looks like it to me. Here's from another artist. And on the back it's written, for the first time he's carrying something he never thought he would. And you can meet Simon Huberband. He was born in 1909, rabbinic family, lost his first wife and child fleeing from home in an air raid in 1939. In Warsaw, he joined ONEG SHABBAT and led his religious section of the Jewish social self-help. He penned one study after another, particularly documenting the religious life in the ghetto, and he and his second wife were rounded up and sent to Treblinka in 1942. One of his friends from the ONEG SHABBAT wrote, our friend Rabbi Huberband was one of the most beautiful people of our time. All of us in ONEG SHABBAT, we swear by all that's holy, that when the day of redemption comes and we remain alive, we will take the bloodiest revenge for your blood. We will remember and honor you forever. Rachela Auerbach was born in 1899. She became a journalist, a translator, and editor, moved to Warsaw in the 1930s, looking for greater opportunities in journalism and Yiddish culture. And in the ghetto, Ringelblum recruited her to run the communal kitchen at 40 Lesno. Later on, he asked her to join ONEG SHABBAT and to keep a diary. And she escaped to the Aryan side of Warsaw in 1943, She survived the war, acting as a Jewish liaison to the Polish resistance. And after the war, she led the campaign to recover the underground archives. She spoke at every rally in private and in her news columns. And at the 3rd anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, she declared, remember, there's a national treasure under the ruins. The Ringelblum archive is there. Even if the rooms are 5 stories high, we have to find the archive. Okay, meet Joseph Kaplan. Kaplan and his friend were recruited by Ringelblum in 42. Kaplan was a militant member of Hashomer Hatzair, a leftist youth group. He was in touch with members of his group in several other ghettos, even managing to visit them and bring news in both directions. He didn't personally write any reports for ONEG Shabbat. He was a founder instead of the Jewish Fighters Organization that later led the Warsaw Revolt. During the Great Roundup in 42, he worked to save Jewish lives by getting Jews protected jobs. But he was captured and executed inside the ghetto by the Gestapo in September 1942 for his organizing work, and he was buried in the ghetto cemetery. Cecilia, we don't have even a picture of Cecilia Slepak, but for the ONEG Shabbat, the lives of Jewish women in the ghetto were documented by her. She was a Vilna-born translator. She was a founder of her own Warsaw literary salon. She was very well known. She was very widely loved. In 42, she conducted 17 interviews with Jewish women from various social backgrounds and professions. I want to tell you, she started with the top of the line ladies of the salon and went all the way down to those who were harlots on the street. This priceless research on daily life in the Warsaw Ghetto shows a shift in the social roles of women during the war, but above all, it praises their versatility, their courage, and their sacrifice. She and her daughter were taken early in the Great Roundup in summer 42, and they died together, Treblinka. This is a terrible stories that I'm telling you, because every one of them is tragic. Every one of these is tragic. On the other hand, every one of these is heroic. Every one of these people, they took their lives and said, I'm going to make something of my life here in the ghetto, something special. Here we do have a photo of some captured women liberation fighters in the Warsaw Revolt. They were as many women as men in the liberation fighting.
Seymour,
Yes.
The other aspect that you're giving us here is such a gift, is humanizing these people. The numbers are so awesome and incredible. And when we think about 265,000 were rounded up at once, and and those massive numbers tend to get anonymous. And so
yes, thank you.
I really thank you for bringing this human aspect to it. I'm curious, and you might not have more information about the one is survival, Rachel Auerbach, if you know more about what she did after the war.
No, I know that in the few years following the Warsaw Ghetto, she devoted herself to the whole finding of the archive. So she was, whereas Hertz knew exactly where to look for the first archive, okay, there were 2 other archives. Now they had all been buried at the same time. We've only found 2. There's still one more archive under the streets of Warsaw. One day, like the 2012 discovery of that wonderful archive in Alsace, one day it's going to turn up, and the historian who finds it is going to be blessed with a whole other piece of this history. What you say is absolutely certain and absolutely true. The enormity of the destruction is such that it's impossible to imagine. If you could know the hopes and dreams of every person who perished, instead of just knowing the numbers, it would be overwhelming. It would be overwhelming. Just knowing these few people is overwhelming.
Yeah, even just having this taste of the handful that you've shared with us is incredible in and of itself.
Right, and we don't have biographies of everyone who worked on the archive, but the idea that that heroism is not something that only comes in one form. It's not just the people who fought. Yes, they were heroes. The people who raised their arms and to take as many German lives as they possibly could before they lost their own, they were certainly heroes. They had done their work. They had put together Molotov cocktails, not Mazel Tov cocktails, but Molotov cocktails. But they knew what they were doing. What they were doing was in a way simpler and more direct and certainly more heroic. But the soldier is only one example of heroism. Imagine this individual who resists not with the rifle, but just with pen and intellect. Now, when Sharansky was imprisoned in Russia, which he was for quite a long time, his wife was part of a campaign in the United States to raise awareness and money for Soviet Jews, okay? And she herself, of course, being Russian, was not a qualified person to write the letters that had to go out. She could tell the stories, but she couldn't write the letters. So I was called by the direct mail marketing people to write the story for her, to write her story, to write the story for Sharansky, and to tell what was going on with him in the prison and how he was going on, so that they could send out the mailings for the student struggle for Soviet Jewry and for the struggle for Soviet Jewry, both the adult and the campus versions. And so I was for a while the voice of Sharansky. Now that won't go down in history. You know something no one knows now, okay? You know something that is sort of a secret. You know, when I was writing about how Sharansky had made a menorah out of a potato, Chanukia out of a potato, that he didn't eat the potato was a big deal. Okay, for Hanukkah, and the prayers and the other prisoners and the study of Hebrew that went on even inside prison. When we wrote those things, we were basing them on the true story of what was happening. It's just that we had to make it into English, so there had to be an English voice. All right, I say that again because these are people who are behind the scenes. These are people whose names we maybe never know among those Jews of Poland, but especially we do know this wonderful historian who was inspired by the Cairo Geniza, by the idea of creating a document, repository of documents, and by the members of his team, the ONEG SHABBAT. And this was the last photograph of him and his son, Uri.
Maybe we can open things up to a few questions.
Yeah, I just have to mention that's a shameless thing to do.
Not shameless at all.
You have to understand. It is, the story is inside this book, the Holocaust and Innocence, and also many, many other wonderful pieces of material about the Holocaust. It's an easy book, easy book. You can buy it for your teenagers, or you can go through it in a couple of hours yourself. So it's really not a hard book, and it really opens up a lot of avenues. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Would anyone like to unmute themselves and ask a question, or ask a question in the chat?
I would. Thank you,
Hi.
Seymour. You have revealed so many layers, like going on an archaeological dig, about the Warsaw Ghetto and about the people. As Dante said, you really made it come to life because it's the people, it's the individuals. And a lot I knew, but a lot I didn't know, and thank you, thank you. And when you talked about the people who wrote with a pen and their intellect, what comes to my mind is the great Rebbe who was known as the Warsaw Rebbe, especially of the children of the Kingdom of Children in the Warsaw Ghetto, Reb Kalonymus Kalman Shapira. Right. I don't know if you've written about him or if he comes into this book, but he was working in the Schultz boot factory, thanks to the young people who he would constantly, teach and talk to. And he would, I don't know where he got all the paper and the pens or pencils or whatever to write down his whole work and philosophy. And he buried it in the earth somewhere there. I don't know whether in the factory or somewhere else. And it was discovered after the war by an American soldier. I don't want to go into too much detail and tell the story, but what's amazing is that this book was then published, and it's the title is The Holy Fire, Eish Gadosh. Right. And it was Reb Shlomo Carlebach who read that book and said, it really touched his heart beyond way. And of course, then he began searching for Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, or rather somebody who would have studied with him, because he was apparently sent to, I think, Treblinka then, and died a few months after that, but he had survived the Warsaw Ghetto. That's a great story also. And, yeah. And it reminds me also of the fact that the diary of Anne Frank was found because it was left behind when the soldiers came and took the Frank family. It just happened to be there and remain in the attic. And when it was found, it was brought to the attention of an American journalist. And that's how it became such a famous diary. It just happened that the journalist was a man named Meyer Levin, who was a great writer of his own. So yep. He recognized immediately the tremendous value of this this book. So yes, this is the story of history, not just not in our time, but archaeologically speaking, the same thing. When we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, it's amazing that all of a sudden, it opens up to us so much knowledge about something that we had so little knowledge. Right. And how was this? And this manuscript was found when a Polish boy was rumbling around, and then found it in just some of the earth. Right. They didn't know what it was, so he sold it for $1 to an American soldier, who then gave it to the chaplain. Right. So this will happen. The third archive will eventually turn up, God willing. They do not publicize this online, that there is a third archive, by the way. You know why? Because otherwise people would be digging holes all over Warsaw. So they don't want to publicize that. They're hoping that it will turn up all by itself, yeah.
So we do see this this screenshot of the book title, The Holocaust and End to Innocence. which includes this story. It's hardly the only book that Rabbi Rossel has authored. There's several others, and I believe his website is rossel.net, Rossel, and you can get a whole list of different books, including Essential Jewish Stories that Penina Shram mentioned, and a Helm book, and lots of other various storybooks, history books. He's been a Jewish educator for longer than any of us can remember.
Oh yeah, before there was a Judaism. You know, so.
Before there was Jews. Before
before Jews even existed.
So anyhow,
Judaism just runs like a river right through me. That's it.
we're delighted that over 20 people and over 20 devices it came. So we usually estimate there's at least 7 or 8 people crowding around each computer. So we think that there were probably maybe 300 to 400 people who watched this particular presentation. But we did record it, and we hope to see you again on Friday night. This Shabbat, we are honoring Rabbi Daniel Aronson, who's going to give the guest sermon because he's taking a pulpit of his own in Keene, New Hampshire. And so he's leaving our religious school to the heights of the mountains. And next Thursday at the same time, Rabbi David Zaslow, long-awaited speaker, is going to talk about his book, Jesus, First Century Rabbi, where he compares the Gospels to the Talmud, neither of which had been written during the time of Jesus. So it's a fascinating account. Some of our members have already read it. Thank you all for being here. And thank you especially to Rabbi Rossel, and keep on learning.
Thank you so much.